Good morning, everyone. I've had quite a few questions about my greenhouse, what kind I'm using, and how I utilize it. And while I am by no means an expert on greenhouses and my current setup could use quite a few improvements, in today's video, I'm just going to try to answer those questions and share my setup as it currently stands. Now, I've had this greenhouse for a little over 5 years, and it originally came from A.M. Leonard, who no longer carries this model. It's a nature's greenhouse, the 6x8 Mythos greenhouse kit. The precise measurements are actually 6 feet 1 inches wide by 8 feet 1 inches long by 6 feet 10 inches tall. Now, the 4mm clear polycarbonate twin wall panels on this Mythos greenhouse were supposed to have twice the heat retention of single layer panels. And I can attest to this because I also have a lean-to style greenhouse on the side of my house that's a single layer polycarbonate. And even being up against a south-facing brick wall, the heat retention in this greenhouse with the double layers is much, much better than in my other greenhouse. It has an aluminum frame and a galvanized steel base. And this greenhouse can be anchored to a concrete slab or pinned directly into the ground using ground pegs. So what we ended up doing here is my husband just leveled off an area to place this greenhouse and then put gravel down. We ended up situating this behind our detached garage, which blocks the greenhouse from north winds, and the woods over here mostly blocks it from west wind. Now, one of the most common questions I get from folks is about wind damage, because it's a very common issue to have wind damage with small greenhouses like this. I have not had any issues with this greenhouse, but I think a lot of that is due to the fact that we positioned it being blocked from our predominant strong winds. Now, that being said, again, comparing it to my lean-to greenhouse, which is protected from the north, a little bit less protected from the west, but it's still in a very sheltered spot. The week after we got that fully assembled, we came home from a trip and the greenhouse was completely mangled. This one, sitting here at the same time, we had no damage on it whatsoever. Now, my husband did assemble this greenhouse for me because he has vastly more patience for construction projects than I do, but the whole process seemed to go together pretty smoothly. Now, one thing to note, on the Nature's Greenhouse site, it actually does say that ground stakes are not included with this greenhouse, but he seems to recall there being ground stakes in the kit when we got it open. Whichever is the case, he did secure this into the ground using pretty significant ground stakes. My guess is those may not be sufficient if you were in an extremely windy, unprotected area, but again, being here, no problems whatsoever. Now, in addition to the twin wall polycarbonate, I've actually covered the entire bottom half of my greenhouse with a layer of bubble wrap. Because I have all of my seedlings in here up on these shelves, I don't need the bottom half to be clear. I don't need light coming through there. So in hindsight, for my setup here, a greenhouse that had solid wood or paneling on the bottom probably would have made more sense. It probably would have let a little less heat leak out, been a little better insulated. I've also considered putting foam insulation along the bottom as a more permanent solution. Another savvy gardener suggested to me that I might look into using phase change material to help passively heat the greenhouse, which is definitely something I will consider looking at some point in the future when I upgrade this thing. But for now, the bubble wrap is a really cheap, easy to install method to just provide a little bit more insulation in here. I simply bought one huge roll of bubble tape and cut it to fit, and I taped it all on using max strength packaging duct tape. I was surprised actually that this stayed up for many seasons. I added the bubble wrap insulation shortly after the greenhouse was up and kept it up for several years. I ended up taking it down last season because I wanted to give the greenhouse a really thorough scrub down, and I wanted to see if it really did make a difference. Early this year, I scrubbed the whole greenhouse down again and added a new layer of bubble wrap. To help further insulate, I do cover the entire roof of the greenhouse with a large, thick blanket on very cold nights. I run a small electric space heater in here. Again, not the most efficient setup, but I'm making do. And I only run this heater when I need to ensure the space is kept above freezing. So a few weeks back, when the nighttime temperature dropped to about 20, 21 degrees Fahrenheit, and I had seedlings in here that were not fully hardened off, I ran the heater overnight just to keep those temperatures above freezing. And I will say, using all of this, using the bubble wrap as added insulation, using the blanket up top to help insulate, it really worked pretty well. I also use shade cloth over the top of the greenhouse when necessary. When I brought my first batch of brassica seedlings out here this year in early March, we had about a week of unseasonably warm and intensely sunny days. That's not super typical for that time of year. Usually we're pretty cool and overcast. It was a silly mistake, but I actually lost an entire batch of cauliflower seedlings to sun scald before I even realized it. So I tossed this large 40% shade cloth over the roof, and that did the trick to save the rest of my brassica seedlings. Now, once the seedlings are fully hardened off, I typically don't need to use that shade cloth anymore, but I kind of did the same thing here recently when I started transferring my warm season crops out. Again, we were getting pretty warm for this time of year. We hit the mid 80s yesterday. That sun is just extraordinarily intense, and it's a greenhouse, so it gets warmer in here. It can be 105 in here before I realize it. So I'm using the shade cloth now as well. And again, that's just to get my seedlings to the point where they're used to the full sun exposure. So if we have several very, very sunny days in a row, I'll keep that shade cover on. I'll pull it off when it's an overcast day. And after about a week or two of that, these seedlings get accustomed to the full sun and I don't need to use it anymore. Now, just as a side note, that shade cloth is also handy in the fall when I'm trying to get fall seedlings hardened off and transitioned into the garden. So I'll use it again when I start bringing those seedlings out of the house. Now, as far as shelving goes, they do actually sell legit shelving for these greenhouses, but I ended up just getting white plastic connect-to-shelf shelving, which has been surprisingly durable. And I like that I can easily rearrange and configure the shelving in here however I want it. I can also just easily pull it out to clean everything down. Now, I am probably losing a little bit of plant space in here with this setup, but again, because I'm just doing seedlings in here, this works really well for me because I've got my seedlings all on the top rows here, and then I use the bottom half of the shelving for storage. I can also, when I'm moving plants out here, and again, if they're not hardened off, if it's their first day out in the full sun, I can actually tuck them on the second level and give them a little bit of shade that way. Now on to how I specifically utilize this greenhouse. Some of you have told me that you are considering getting a greenhouse, but you're just not sure if it's worth the investment because frankly, even a small greenhouse like this is pretty pricey, and it's a big investment if you're not sure that it's going to be worth it. So as I've kind of alluded to already, I primarily use this for finishing off, hardening off seedlings. For the most part, I start all of my transplants in the house, but I've only got so much space on my seed starting rack. So once I A, run out of space, or B, need to start acclimating seedlings to outdoor conditions, they all move out to the greenhouse. So for example, I started all of my cool season brassicas, my early season lettuce and leafy greens, that type of thing, in this house on the seed starting rack in February. By mid to late March, I needed the space on the seedling rack to start more crops, so I moved everything out to the greenhouse. This helps them get acclimated to cooler temperatures, gives them more exposure to natural sunlight rather than the grow lights, and more air circulation, as I typically open both the roof vent and the door. Now, it would be nice if this model had a screen door option. It doesn't that I'm aware of. So instead, I just slide this screen over the bottom so that my chickens and dogs or any other curious creatures can't get in here. I also like moving them out here because it allows me to use my really good but really stinky fertilizer that I can't use in the house because it ends up stinking the entire place up. I also find that allowing my seedlings at least several weeks, if not longer, out here in the greenhouse tends to yield healthier, stronger, and more resilient seedlings when I'm ready to transplant them into the garden. It also significantly simplifies the process of hardening seedlings off. So what I would typically do is bring my flats of plants outdoors to a protected location. I used to put them on this table in a protected corner of my patio and gradually increase the amount of time they spend outdoors. So an example of what that might look like, when I'm ready to start hardening off, say, my pepper plants, I have them on my seed starting rack in my front living room. When I'm ready to start hardening them off, I will bring that whole flat out, set it on that patio table, leave them out for an hour or two max if it's super sunny. Ideally, I want to do that on an overcast day, but I don't always have the luxury of getting that timing just right. So an hour or two, I have to watch them really carefully. They will get sun scald really easily if it's a sunny day. Then I bring them back in the house. The next day, I give them a smidge more time. Say if they did 2 hours the first day, it's 3 hours the next day, 4 hours the next day, 5 hours the next day, etc. Some folks say do this, for 5 days to a week. My hardening off process typically always takes at least 2 weeks. And again, it's so time consuming because I'm constantly having to babysit those plants, make sure they're not getting overly exposed to the sun. Not a huge deal, but when you got 10,000 other things going on, it's easy to forget about them. And it does become quite a process moving them in and out all the time. So with the greenhouse, because they are a little more protected, I can typically bring flats out, let them sit out here. Like I said, the only thing I might do is cover the entire greenhouse with shade cloth if it's a potently sunny day. Otherwise, they're pretty much coming out here and staying out here until I'm ready to transplant them out. Now, early in the season, as I mentioned, I do have to be careful and watch those nighttime lows. Once in a while, I will run that heater just to keep it above freezing in here. Also early in the season, if I'm trying to harden off frost tender crops like peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, that type of thing, I might bring them back in the first couple of nights if it's getting really chilly, but it's out of an abundance of caution. It's not always necessary if it's above freezing in the greenhouse. The main thing is I like to avoid a lot of unnecessary stress on my young seedlings at this point in their life. Now, as I mentioned, also, I'm very careful to keep the greenhouse vented. I keep this window vent open almost all of the time. I keep the door open almost all of the time. If you've not had a greenhouse before, it can be shocking how quickly it can get so hot in here. For example, the other morning, it was a beautiful, warm, sunny morning, but it was only like 9 o'clock in the morning in the middle of April. And I was a little late getting outside to do my chores. I got to the greenhouse about 9:30 and it was already 110 in here. And that's at 9:30 in the morning in April. Like, that was crazy to me. But again, it's just pretty much a routine for me to open everything up as long as it's a warm-ish day. So I'll have my seedlings out here minimum amount of time, again, about 2 weeks. Sometimes they sit out here for a month until I'm ready to plant them. Sometimes with my more finicky crops, I will actually transfer them out into an even more exposed area. So recently I've just been putting them out in this trailer that's sitting next to the greenhouse just to get full sun, full wind exposure, or I will go out and actually set the flats like in a raised bed in my garden just for a few days until I'm ready to plant. That's really probably not necessary, but again, I'm way over cautious with my seedlings in that whole hardening off process. So I find that this, again, much easier than my standard process of hardening off without a greenhouse. I also find that my transplants respond very well to being out here. Now, I also do a very small amount of seed starting out here, primarily for cool season crops that respond better to cool temperatures for germination. Spinach is a big one. Sometimes I have issues with spinach not wanting to germinate well indoors under my grow lights because it's just too warm in there. So if that's the case, I'll just bring my seeded flat out here, let them sit. They'll pop eventually. They do really well out here. I might also use it if I'm just out of room to do a lot of my other leafy greens. So lettuces work well out here, kale, chard, even very early in the season when it is still quite cool. Now, they'll typically take quite a bit longer to germinate at those cooler temperatures versus the 70 or 68 degrees in the house. But if I'm not in a hurry to get those seedlings started, that works well out here. Now, I may get the question about starting fall crops out here in the greenhouse. So here in Ohio, I'm typically starting a batch of cool season crops, things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, another batch of lettuce, kale, chard, leafy greens, those types of things. I'm starting those from seed in July for an August transplant for a fall harvest. I do not start those seedling flats out here in the greenhouse because at that time of year in July in Ohio, it is just way too warm and I cannot keep the temperatures cool enough in here, even with a shade cloth, to get good germination. I typically have much better results, again, starting in the climate controlled house. When those seedlings are up and thriving, I will move them out here to get them used to the heat, but just in terms of getting them started, getting them germinated, it works much better in the house. Sometimes I also use this greenhouse to grow a batch of my Microdwarf tomatoes and peppers. Now I'm sure I could do full-size tomatoes and peppers in here too if I tweaked my setup a little bit, but I really enjoy growing the Microdwarf types in little tiny pots. And again, it works really well for me to start those in the house. Once they're ready to be up potted, I do that and then I move the pots out to the greenhouse. In the summer, that works really well. Now, if I had a really efficient way to heat this, it would be fun to play around with extending that season, growing a little earlier, growing a little late in the season with those peppers and tomatoes. Right now, I don't, so I just primarily get them started early. And then about this time of year would typically be moving them out. And that gives me an earlier harvest than my garden tomatoes or peppers. Now, one thing I haven't tried, but am considering doing in the future is growing cucumbers in this greenhouse. I have a pretty good setup right now with growing more compact varieties indoors under grow lights. But I've been considering moving that operation out here, obviously minus the grow lights. I've had such trouble with dealing with cucumber beetles out in the garden that growing in the greenhouse is a really appealing option for me. So at some point in the future, I might try that again. It would be with more compact varieties. I'd probably have to rearrange my setup in here. So I'd love to hear from any of you who have a smaller greenhouse like this. If you've tried growing cucumbers, how has that gone for you? Now, another use is I have found that I can get a super early start on potatoes grown in large containers or grow tubs in this greenhouse. So what I end up doing is planting my potatoes out in the grow tubs. I will keep them in the greenhouse early in the season. So this I would typically be planting in very, very early March. Some years it can still be quite cold and wet here. A potato outdoors is going to take a long time to sprout, but in the greenhouse, because I can get a little warmer, a little more climate controlled, I can get those sprouted and growing. And then once we're past the frost-free date, I can move those outdoors. And again, it really gives me a jump start on the harvest from those container plantings. And then the other main use I have for this small greenhouse is overwintering some of my more tender potted plants. I used to move my container blueberries out here for the winter, but I found that they actually don't need any extra protection here in Ohio. However, I do find this useful for some of my marginally hardy plants. So I grow razzmatazz grapes in containers, which are only hardy to zone 7. Same thing with a lot of my figs. If I can move them out here in the pots, give them a little more winter protection, that helps a lot. Plus, they're still getting plenty of light versus being like in a garage or something with less windows. So if I'm going to do that, typically those items are in bigger pots. So I just move some of my shelving out, put the pots right in here. Sometimes I will still put some straw or leaves around the base of the pots to keep the soil insulated. Works really well. So I guess to answer the question of whether the greenhouse is worth it or not, I think for me, it was definitely worth the investment. I will say I have gotten my money out of it between just having room for more seedlings, not having to run as many grow lights, not having all of this stuff cluttering up the house all the time. It's definitely been worth it in the long run. I'd love to upgrade and have a much bigger greenhouse, but now I'm kind of stuck on that fence of, is that going to be worth the investment for me? I think if I were to start all over, as I mentioned, I'd look into slightly different setups, different models. I'd look into better ways to more efficiently heat the greenhouse so that I could start more seeds out here. I'd also really love to have the capability of growing more year round, or at least extending that season and keeping plants alive through the winter. That's gonna require something a little bit more heat efficient than what I have here. So I continue to research. Hopefully someday I'll have a really awesome, large passive solar heated type of greenhouse, but that's a dream for me for the future. And for those of you who already have that type of setup, again, I'd love to hear from you. What has worked, what hasn't, what would you recommend? And as always, if you have comments or further questions that I haven't answered in this video, definitely drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.